So let's actually begin this process over here on my desktop. That's that Windows 8.1 machine we've been using in the past. And this is just me. I'm logged in here to this Windows desktop. And the only thing I want to show you here is the fact that everything we're about to do here with DFS, either half of DFS, is really intended to be transparent from the perspective of the user. And so if I was on this machine and I needed to go to, for example, a share over there on file 1, the result of what the users are going to see will be relatively similar to what they see now with a traditional share. On this machine, for example, I have a share called Company Shared that we've used before. And in this Company Shared location, I have just some stuff that I copied here that we can take a look at as we go through setting up Replication and Namespaces both. Here are, for example, some articles. And in this folder, there are a couple of subfolders here for a variety of different articles I've written over the years. It's just a bunch of content that we can replicate from one place to the other. I show you this because the first step that we need to configure is DFS namespaces. And for the most part, in what we're configuring here, the result of what we're about to do will look very similar to what we've already seen. Let me come back over here to our server file 1. This is file1.company.pri. This is the location that we attempted to look at just a second ago. And I want to show you here that on this machine, I've added in the appropriate roles and role services that will allow us to do both halves of DFS. Over here in the list of server roles and features, right down here, I've installed the DFS namespaces and DFS replication role services onto this machine. And what that gives me access to is right down here, the DFS management console, which, as you can see, both halves of DFS are represented. For the first thing, or for the first step in this process, let's actually go through the configuration of a namespace, which will point to that company shared location that we want to make available. This will seem altogether uninteresting because it's more or less repointing the existing share on file 1 now to a new location that corresponds with domain. I'll come over here and choose to create a new namespace on the server file 1. And then on that server file 1, we then need to create a name for the namespace that we're interested in. Now, this name for the namespace does not necessarily need to be the same thing as the share name that we saw just a second ago. Instead, what we want to create is a location that users can go to where subfolders of which, at least from their perspective, will be the variety of different folders or shares that already exist. So let's just call this namespace Everything. I name this Everything because in this little environment that we're creating, this single namespace will allow me to then plug in all the other local shares on those machines under a single path that users can point to. Now, just like any old share, we also need to configure the permissions on that share, as well as the location as to where it goes. Over here under the Edit Settings item is where we can configure what the local path will be for this share that we're creating now. Remember, this is not yet the company's shared location. We'll plug that in here in a second after we configure this DFS root. Our local path currently is C DFS roots everything, and then you can also configure some permissions on this shared folder as well, which I'll configure as all users with read and write permissions. Here in a second, we'll actually go through and plug in that company's shared, the existing share on this server. So remember that here at this point, we're just configuring the root. We're not actually plugging in all those additional shares on the servers in our environment. So let's configure this with those settings then. And down here is where we can configure which type of namespace we want to create. This is actually a fairly important distinction here because on one hand you have what's called a domain-based namespace, where the namespace and pathing itself exists in Active Directory. On the other side you have what's called a standalone namespace, which corresponds to the file server on which we've installed DFSN. Now in the case of a standalone namespace, you're effectively creating a share, just like you would a traditional share, that collects and aggregates all the links that we'll be talking about here in just a second. So short of hosting this share on top of a failover cluster, as you can see down here, this doesn't provide you any high availability for the share. Now this stands in contrast with a domain-based namespace, where when the namespace itself exists in Active Directory, any Active Directory domain controller can point that user to the correct location as long as you just have an Active Directory in place for them to reference against. Now the biggest difference here is the idea down here that with a domain-based namespace, you're actually referring to the name of the domain itself as the source location for that share. So here we're doing //company.pri/everything is the root for the namespace we're creating. This is different from down here on the bottom where again, it's just the file server itself. Now, you do this here in Windows Server 2008 mode so that you can support that scalability as a function of Active Directory, and also so you can support access-based enumeration, as you can see up here. Be aware that if you should choose the non-Server 2008 mode and you later need to enable it, the only way to do that is to actually remove and then recreate the namespace in order to turn on this extra functionality like access-based enumeration. Now in our environment here, we want to create that domain-based namespace because it gives us the ability to access it as long as we have access to an Active Directory domain controller. So I'll choose Next here, and then choose the Create item down here to go about creating the namespace. So what we've done here has nothing yet to do with our company shared folder that we saw just a second ago. In order for us to actually get that connected up, we then need to, from the namespace, then add in a folder which becomes the first in that series of links that we want to aggregate under the namespace. So let me choose New Folder here, and I'm going to call this the Company Shared folder, Company Shared, because that's the folder it is. And then for the folder target over here, we will set up the path to the folder target on our server file 1, and we'll associate it with that share Company Shared right here. If I hit OK, and then OK, that now creates the share that exists here under the namespace. So this gives you an example of exactly what we're attempting to accomplish here, but it's perhaps better to visualize if we pop back over here to our machine My Desktop. Now again, the whole point behind DFS namespaces is that it gives you the abilities to aggregate these links together. So rather than now going to file1/whatever, we now can go to company.pri/everything/whatever to get access to our company shared location. From here, if all the permissions are configured correctly, well, then I can then go through and access all the articles that I was looking at before. You can think of this DFSN solution as kind of a share virtualization solution, as it were, in that what this allows you to do is to create a single stable location, which is the starting point for all your users. And then under the covers, you can move around your different shares to different servers if need be, or different locations, without having to change the path that the users will use to connect to it. Now back here on my server file 1, once I have these shares configured here in DFSN, we've got a couple of other configurations that we can make as well. Some of these will make more sense also as we get into the DFSR components.